Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. So yesterday we just kind of talked about some of the financial stuff with Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, how they started having beef with each other. Really, really important with the national bank, right? Because you had two founders of the United States, two founders of the Constitution, two writers of it, who could not agree on the fundamental, baseline comprehension of what the Constitution meant. That you're going to have two sides with a loose constructionist and a strict constructionist, like Jefferson was a strict constructionist and Alexander Hamilton is a loose constructionist. That's probably one of the more important things in early American history to understand is that the writers of the Constitution couldn't even necessarily always agree on what it meant. And the issue that it revolved around was the national bank. So while the national bank itself may not seem that important, the fact that those two men argued viciously over whether it was even allowed, and they both wrote the document that either allowed or disallowed it, is very telling as we move through American history and you start seeing people argue over, what does the Constitution mean? Because you still get arguments today on it. All right, but today we're going to start talking about a lot more specific stories, and this is really cool. All right, so the first thing that we're going to talk about today is the Whiskey Rebellion. Also incredibly important. Now, the reason this is going to be so important, and it's really not a huge thing, is because it is the first time the new government gets challenged, all right? And it happens early on. So George Washington is the president. Alexander Hamilton's Secretary of Treasury still, and he's taxing people. Old TJ, Thomas Jefferson, he's already quit. There's this guy named John Jay that has come in to replace Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State. So Hamilton, he's looking at ways of raising money, and he decides to make an excise tax. I'm pretty sure this is going to shock him over the reaction to this, but an excise tax is something a tax you put on something that people don't need. Something they'll buy, but they don't need. Very famously, or most common excise tax would be like on cigarettes today. Cigarette companies probably only make about $1 a pack of cigarettes, but if a pack of cigarettes costs $5, $6, $7, up to $20, depending on where you are in the country. The rest of that is all taxes. So the government puts those taxes on there, and it's called an excise tax. Whereas in one part they put that tax in there to try to prevent people from buying it. But on the other hand, the more they buy, the more taxes the government makes. And if people just decide to boycott it and not buy it, fine. Is not something they need anyway. So an excise tax is just an extra tax put on stuff that people don't need. Well, in the 1700s, Americans drank a ton of whiskey, all right? Like the average adult human in America drank 5 gallons of whiskey a year, all right? That's a lot when you spread that out. That's a lot regardless of who you are. So, Alexander Hamilton was like, I'm going to put an excise tax on whiskey because people don't need whiskey, and when they buy it, since they buy so much of it, it'll give us more money. Well, a lot of people not happy with that, and I think it caught them off guard. What's interesting is in Pennsylvania, in the mountains of Pennsylvania, which is extremely rural, still is today, there are people there at the time that would make their own whiskey and drink their own whiskey. Like they weren't buying it anywhere. Well, since it's an excise tax and it gets put on whiskey, even if they're making it themselves, they're still required to pay taxes on something they didn't even buy. So if you make it, you have to pay money because you made it. All right. Needless to say, the people up there are not big fans of this. So how do they pay their taxes? There's literally a tax collector, a guy that comes by and is like, see, you're making whiskey. Give me money so I can go give it to the federal government. How do you think it's going to work out for this guy? Not well. They start attacking these guys. They actually start tarring and feathering them, which you see it in like movies. This is a drawing of them tarring and feathering this guy. It's permanent damage. It's like third-degree burns, and that tar will burn your skin and adhere to your skin. And then the feathers, while it makes it look funny, as the tar dries, it sucks in the feathers, so those little needles go in, and it just basically starts making you into a pin cushion. being tarred and feathered, a lot of people die from being tarred and feathered. It is torture. It is absolutely awful. It's not to make you look silly or anything like that. It is a vicious, vicious attack. I mean, and you'll be permanently scarred for life if you survive. It's absolutely awful. So I need to reference that when you talk about people being tarred and feathered. Typically, my understanding is it's most of the time it is not fatal, but they are it's like slightly burning them for their whole body. So you'll be scarred your whole body your entire life. It's incredibly painful, but my understanding is most people survive. There are absolutely people who die from this trauma, but I do think most of the time they survive. But it is about the most brutal thing you can do to somebody, and they still survive. All right, so tarring and feathering is not a light thing. So they start tarring and feathering the tax collectors. So now keep in mind, this is in Pennsylvania. The capital at the time is in Philadelphia, which is also in Pennsylvania. So this is happening theoretically right down the road from the capital. Alexander Hamilton hears that people are rebelling against his taxes, and he freaks out. He's like, oh my gosh, what do I do? What do I do? So Alexander Hamilton decides he's going to call out the army. All right. So the army is there in Philadelphia. He's going to have them march over and put this thing down. So he's like running down the hall, and he pokes his head into the president's office. Because remember, there's no White House yet. Washington, D.C. isn't even made. So they're just like, I imagine it's just like an office building type thing in the 1700s. And he's like, they're rebelling against the taxes. I'm going to send the army in. I'm going to do this. Just want to get your okay on it. And George Washington, all right, and on top of everything else, this makes this story so cool. He says, they're doing what? And he's like, they're rebelling. He's like, no, they ain't. Oh, no, they ain't. And George Washington just hops up and just like takes running off out the door. And Alexander Hamilton's like, what is he doing? So Alexander Hamilton goes out. There's like stables there where the horses are and everything. And George Washington, as Alexander Hamilton goes out to like get the army ready to ride out there, George Washington, the President of the United States, runs into the stables, puts on his own military uniform, grabs his own saber, his own sword, hops on his white horse, and takes off, all right, out of town to go put this rebellion down itself. When the soldiers see that George Washington is taking off himself, they're like, oh, like that's, this is the hero of everybody. And they're like, so they're all racing to get on their horses and start marching and to take off. So George Washington, and I'm oversimplifying the story a little bit, but it's, in my mind, this is how it plays out. And as far as accuracy, it's as good as any. George Washington rolls up on this, in the western part of Pennsylvania, rolls up on where people are just, riding and burning things down. Like you can see over here, like just riding. He rolls up in his white horse. All right. And I really want to say he hops off and starts roundhouse kicking everybody, dropping bows on them, like beheading people. That doesn't happen. Now, would George Washington probably have tried that? Possibly. All right. When George Washington is so famous and so well respected, and keep in mind, he's a huge human being. All right. When he rolls up in the middle of this on his horse, the entire riot stops. They're like, he's here. And he's like, yo, stop it. Stop doing stupid stuff. Go home, right? And everybody there just drops their weapons and runs home. The army shows up behind them. Here's a picture of this, much more fancy here in this picture, but the army shows up. They're out of breath, we're here. They do end up arresting 150 people who had been tarring and feathering these tax guys and sentenced them to death. All right, so they got rounded up, sentenced to death. But then George Washington will pardon all of their death sentences. I'm sure they still spent some time in jail, had punishments, but their death sentences he pardoned. So nobody is executed for this. But this is called the Whiskey Rebellion, and it is crazy important in American history. Here's why. Now, it just seems like a neat little story that doesn't, really mean anything. However, the reason they were rebelling is they were unhappy with being taxed. They started using terms like no taxation without representation. They're like, what are you you talking about? You absolutely have a representative. Like, that's not a thing. Like, you can't just say things because you don't want to pay taxes. That's not how it works. But they were upset with how they're being taxed, and they started a rebellion. Now, how did that work when Daniel Shea started a rebellion under the Articles of Confederation? He wrecked shop, took over big parts of Massachusetts, and nobody came to stop him. All right? And it showed the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. When they started rioting over whiskey, the federal military showed up and shut that thing down. This is incredibly important in American history because it shows that the federal government can enforce their laws. They say something, they mean it. When the federal government can make a law and then enforce it, it shows the strength of the federal government and therefore the strength of the Constitution. So it is incredibly important because the Shays Rebellion showed the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, whereas the Whiskey Rebellion shows the strength of this new government. So while the Whiskey Rebellion isn't a huge thing, all right, as far as the numbers of people that were killed or anything like that, it is incredibly important because it's the first time the United States government has been challenged, and they absolutely knocked it out of the park as far as how you enforce your laws. And George Washington literally showed up himself, all right, on his white horse. You ever hear about somebody like showing up on their white horse? That comes from George Washington's horse was white. And anyway, so absolutely, fundamentally is going to cause more respect for the United States government. And when the government says something, they mean it and they're going to enforce it. So this is a little cartoon. It says the battle of the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, which we're getting ready to start talking about here either today or in the next lesson. So Hamilton says he has the right to, and you can't see it down here. Below this says, the new Constitution gives the federal government the right to tax, period, let's tax. That's what it says at the bottom there that you can't see. And it says, this one is put on whiskey, a strong, and then below it says drink made from grain. And then these guys say Easterners are stealing our money because they feel like these are mountain folk that make their own whiskey. They shouldn't have to pay a tax on it. They start tarring and feathering people here. Alexander Hamilton is made to look completely incompetent here. He's like, what are they doing? If they're stealing all our money, they won't pay. And then George Washington rolls in this cartoon, he's like, oh, I'm so sad. This basically says that they arrested him. And I told you wrong. It was 150 people were arrested for it. 2 were condemned to die. These are the guys that were doing the tarring and feathering. But those 2 were not condemned to die, because it would be weird if every single person involved in the riot was condemned to die. That would be a little overkill as far as rightful justice. So of the 150 that were arrested, 2 were sentenced to death, but Washington is going to allow them not to be murdered, not to be executed. And this is a good sign because this shows George Washington riding off. He's like, America is finally strong enough without me. And we're going to talk about here soon the end of his term. All right. So Whiskey Rebellion, incredibly important. And I want you to go through and answer this in 2 complete sentences. Very important. And you'll see this quite often in the future. All right. Jay's Treaty. Changing gears here. All right. Another cool story. If I went through and told this story really quick, it would seem really boring. But I'm going to spend some time on it, and you're really going to like it. This is cool. Oh, John Jay. Guy's name's John Jay. So he is the new Secretary of State in place of Thomas Jefferson. All right. So he's the guy that deals with other countries. What ends up happening is France and England are at war. All right. Shocker. France and England are at war. It's like a Tuesday. Somebody stepped on somebody's sneakers. Somebody talked about somebody's mama. England and France just go to war. They always seem to go to war. All right. So America, we see this. George Washington's still the president. And he's like, nah, we ain't getting involved. We're just gonna act like it's not happening. We're gonna trade with England and France. We're not gonna get involved. Now, it's kind of odd how it works out because, well, we're just gonna say we stay neutral. George Washington's like, we're staying out of it. We're not having anything to do with any of this. So here's what. Let me see if this will show up for me. Oh, don't need that many of them. All right, interwebs. All right, so here's what is happening. I'll use a pink line. We are going to continue to trade with France, and we are going to continue to trade with England, listed here as the United Kingdom. Talk about that later on about the differences in them. But for this class, UK, United Kingdom, England, Britain, all that is interchangeable for this survey course. All right, so what is happening is we're sending merchant ships. Now, these two countries here are at war, all right? Those two countries there are at war. We send these merchant ships over to France and to England. What ends up happening is our ships that are selling over here to France, England comes down, I'll do them in yellow, and starts taking our ships headed to France, all right? When our ships go to France, they start to be captured by the British. And the British aren't just stealing the stuff that are on the ships. What they do is they force those sailors, they're merchants, they're not military guys, to go fight in the British Navy. They take their ships and they force them into the Navy, and that's called the impressment of seamen. All right. Mr. Wagstaff said seamen. All right. Giggle, giggle, giggle. And this is the dumb stuff in history that frustrates me. So it's been called the impressment of seamen forever. And apparently at some point, somebody in the textbook industry is like, we can't keep having history teachers say seamen because the kids will just giggle the whole time. So here's what we're going to do. We're, for no good reason, going to change the term from the impressment of seamen, meaning you're forcing sailors into somebody else's army against their will. We're going to change that term from the impressment of seamen to violating a ship's neutrality. Unnecessary to do that. All right, just giggle and get it over with, but whatever. I say that because on test questions, you will see sometimes they say impressment of seamen. Sometimes they say violating a ship's neutrality. Both of those are just fancy ways of saying they took our ships, all right? And England is taking our ships that are headed to France, taking the goods to England, and then forcing these ships into the British military. Now, clearly, we are not fans of that in the United States. So, all right. So, we don't want that to happen anymore. Like, that's clearly not cool, England. All right. England didn't care if it made us mad. They really didn't. Why? Because what are we going to do about it? Nothing. They're going to take what they want, and there's nothing we can do because we're not strong enough. If we get mad at them, who cares? Whatever. Like, so even though we beat them in war, all right, we gain no respect from anybody. So they acknowledge that we're a country, but they don't really care if they take us off or not because we're not militarily strong enough to do anything. So we're going to get pushed around here early on in American history by these other countries who don't respect us militarily. All right, respect in large part in history comes down to your military prowess. If you have a dominant military, people have to respect you. North Korea today, Kim Jong-un 100% believes if he can get nukes, then he'll be treated with more respect. While it's easy to roll your eyes at that, if you look at history, that's typically what happens. Because as soon as America, later on in U.S. history, gets pretty dominant militarily, guess who everybody's willing to listen to? America. All right? But at this point, we are not very strong. And because of that, we get pushed around. So this is a picture here of the British taking over. These are merchants. These are not like military guys, and they're being forced into the British military. So the question here is, why are they not worried about our reaction? So pause if you need to and get 2 complete sentences on that. So what John Jay is going to do, all right, is John Jay here, and this is a picture of John Jay. God, he's losing his hair. I'm really glad I have great genetics, and I'll never be losing my hair. All right, so John Jay, he is sent by Washington over to England. What do you think his job is? His job is to be like, hey, England, stop taking our ships. Like, don't do it. So John Jay gets on a ship, goes over to England, meets with the leaders of England, and is like, hey, stop taking our ships. All right. England looks at him and says, no. Like, just, no. We're going to keep taking your ships. Like, what you going to do about it? So, this, like, John Jay's like, what? That's not good. Like, can we negotiate? And they're like, nah. We're going to keep taking your ships, and there's really nothing you can do about it. So, there's that. Now, England does want to continue trading with America. So, England, they're going to, like, throw us a bone. They're going to throw America a bone. They're going to do something for us. Or they're going to present it like they're doing us a favor, when in actuality, they're not. All right. So, what they say that they're going to do, like, all right, look, I don't want y'all to be salty at us. We're going to keep taking your ships that's going to France. We're going to keep doing that. All right. So now, if you trade with England, they don't take your ships if you're heading to England. But if you're heading to France, who they're at war with, that's when they take your ships. So they're like, you can just stop trading with France. And we're like, yeah, we're not going to do that because we're not picking a side. And he's like, all right, well, so we're going to keep taking your ships that go to France. But to let you know that we're not trying to, pick a fight with you, here's what we're going to do. All right. So let me go back up here. I got another map here. Wait on my map. So they're going to remove troops from what is the western part of the United States. Let me explain to you what I mean by that. So this is, let me get a color that you can see. We'll do pink. This right here, more or less, is America. All right. All of this here, this is all the junk here. This is all Indian country. Anything on this side, all that's Indian country. All right. So England had still, after the Revolutionary War, since this was unoccupied territory, they still had these forts, all right, over here in western part of the United States. At the time, they still had forts over here. That's not in America because nobody owns it. So they still had forts here filled with soldiers. So here's what England's going to do. They're going to say, hey, America, tell you what we'll do. Just to show that we're going to try to be buddies, we are going to bring all of our troops home that are over here, and we're going to empty those forts out. All right, we're going to do that for you. But so that way, if you ever decide to expand this way, there's nothing standing in your way. We're going to just, let you do your own thing. So they tell America they're going to do this basically so we don't get super salty about the fact that they're still going to take our ships. However, the real reason they're doing this is they have a whole bunch of troops over here, all right, still, that are just sitting here while they're at war with France. They need to bring these troops back home. All right, that's not a very good arrow, but they need to bring those troops back home anyway. So they get to bring their troops back home while simultaneously making it look like they're doing America a solid. All right. Now, this is what is presented to John Jay. So he goes over there to be like, stop taking our ships. And they're like, no, we're gonna keep taking your ships, and there's nothing you can do about it. But we'll bring home troops from the western part of the United States as, friends. All right. John Jay doesn't have an option here. He has to sign this treaty. All right. Which is the worst treaty ever. Nothing happens. So he signs it and it becomes Jay's treaty. I think this is pretty funny. This is John Jay proposing his treaty. This is the actual Jay's treaty. All right. So it really doesn't benefit America at all at the time. All right. However, the reason I'm spending so much time on Jay's treaty, as dumb as it is it is going to have massive, massive implications relatively soon in American history. It's like a little snowball that gets rolling down a hill and like gets bigger and bigger and then takes out a house or something. They show that on movies. I've never been able to do that myself. Like where you roll it down a hill and it gets bigger. Maybe it's a good thing. Maybe I don't need to know how to make destructive weapons. But so Jay's treaty, it is important to understand how useless it is and how dumb it is, but actually what it is. All right. So what does it not do? It does not stop England from taking our ships. What does it do? In theory, it's England promises to pull out their troops and to not stop America from expanding in the future. That is very important. We're going to come back to that. We're going to forget about Jay's treaty for about a lesson, and then we're going to come back to it, and it's a pivotal importance. But England promises with Jay's treaty that we are not, meaning Britain will not stop America from spreading westward if we so desire. All right. So, it's really not an effective treaty, but it is what it is. We tried our best. So why did John Jay originally go to England, and what was the outcome of his trip, and why would England offer to concede anything to the United States? Like why did they offer to give us anything? So we have talked about that. Answer that in complete sentences, and pause it if you need to, and moving on. All right, Jeffersonian Republicans. So, all right, I just need to explain this about what is happening. George Washington is still the president. Everybody loves George Washington. All right, Thomas Jefferson hates Alexander Hamilton. All right. Alexander Hamilton, he thinks Alexander Hamilton is trying to make the government too big. Alexander Hamilton thinks a big government is good because it's a bigger government that can help the people. Thomas Jefferson's like, big government, bad government, period. We need to be more agricultural. Like, we don't need to have this big manufacturing thing. We just need to like stick to the basics. That's what America needs. And Hamilton's like, we can make it better. Like, why would we not? So they absolutely hate each other. Thomas Jefferson quits the Secretary of State and no longer calls himself a Federalist, right? He's going to show back up a couple years later, and his big nemesis here, as we've been talking about, is Alexander Hamilton. So this is Hamilton, this is Thomas Jefferson. Absolutely dislike each other, all right? Thomas Jefferson is going to create a new political party, all right? And I don't know where I can put myself. I'll just stick myself down here in the corner. So this is Thomas Jefferson, and this is Alexander Hamilton. So Alexander Hamilton is a Federalist. Almost everybody was a Federalist at the time. Supported the idea of a federal government. That's what the Federalists were, right? However, Thomas Jefferson doesn't like the direction, so he's going to come out and he's going to create a new type of government. Sorry, not a new type of government, a new political party. Basically, a different interpretation of the Constitution. They all like the Constitution, but it's a different interpretation of it. Now, bear with me for a second, because this, once again, dumb things in history that make things too complicated. Just like the impressment of seamen and violating a ship's neutrality. Unnecessary vocabulary words. Here's another example of it. Thomas Jefferson comes out and he creates a political party that they call themselves Republicans. They call themselves Republicans. All right? Now, we will never call them Republicans in history class. The reason that we won't call them Republicans in history class is because they have nothing to do with the Republicans that currently exist present day in the United States. Completely different. So, in history, they go back, they can't even agree on what to call them, because if they just call them Republicans, they're afraid it's going to confuse people. All right? Listen to this logic. Can't just call them Republicans, that'll confuse them. So we're going to call them, so Thomas Jefferson's Republican Party, we're going to call them Jeffersonian Republicans, all right? So they don't confuse with the regular Republican Party. You could go with that, all right? That's usually what I use in my class. I call them Jeffersonian Republicans. However, then other history books are like, okay, well, so we don't confuse them, we're going to call them Democratic Republicans. What? Well, and that's starting to get more popular, I've noticed, in history present day. They start referring to them more as Democratic Republicans in history, as opposed to Jeffersonian Republicans. So it is frustrating. If you ever see Democratic Republicans or Jeffersonian Republicans, it's the political party of Thomas Jefferson, who wants small government, all right? So here's what the Federalists and the Republicans, of what their differences are. Party of Hamilton, and then John Adams, who's the vice president, and we're going to start talking about him here relatively soon. Wants a strong central government and a central bank, because that was Hamilton's idea. Protective tariffs, powerful navy, favored businesses and wealthy people. Supported this manufacturing, like tax cuts to the wealthy. Support from New York and New England. And then a loose interpretation of the Constitution. Like, the Constitution only basically tells you what you can't do and what you can't violate when you're talking about people's rights. So here's what Thomas Jefferson comes out, and he gets a big following. Keep in mind, this is the man who wrote the Declaration of Independence, wrote the Constitution. So anything he says, he's going to have a pretty big following. So, party of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and we'll talk about James Madison more as we move forward. He thinks the central government should be tiny, itty bitty. State banks should be state banks are the banks that should matter. There should not be a federal bank because he thinks the federal bank makes the federal government too strong. Very minimal navy. All right. He thinks the military is a waste of money. Democracy for farmers, craftsmen, and ordinary people. All right. He supports an agricultural society. I added this part here in at the bottom to clarify. He doesn't, he's like, man, we're just going to have some farms. We're going to grow food. We're a family structure, very small, stay out of people's business and just do our own thing. Like the Federalists, they're like, hey, we can do manufacturing. We can start, people can start being wealthy and rich and all that. And Thomas Jefferson's like, no, being rich, that's not a thing. Like that's just going to cause problems. What we want is like family structure, agriculture, small, simple, be left alone, religious, like kind of old school. Like he doesn't want to progress. He doesn't want to make America bigger and stronger. He doesn't like he doesn't think rich people need to exist or anything like that. It just needs to be farming, family first, So in present day, neither one, Federalists or these guys, wouldn't fit in either political party today. So that's why in history, we make sure to clarify these Republicans were Thomas Jefferson's Republicans, so we call them either Jeffersonian Republicans or Democratic Republicans. They can't even agree in history on what they want to call them. But at the time, they only called themselves Republicans. So if you got a time machine and went back, they'd only call themselves, they'd be like, oh, we're Republicans. So here's the two questions here, all right? Why is Thomas Jefferson's political party referred to in history books as the Jeffersonian Republicans or Democratic Republicans, even though they just called themselves Republicans while he was alive? We talked about that in detail, so get two complete sentences on that. And then number 10, Thomas Jefferson created a political party that was against the Federalist. So why was Thomas Jefferson an anti-Federalist? So was Thomas Jefferson an anti-Federalist? That's the question. And explain what. No, he wasn't. He was not an anti-Federalist. All right. So explain what an anti-Federalist is that we had talked about with the creation of the Constitution. All right. So just go through and explain how you can be against the Federalist, but you wouldn't be an anti-Federalist because that's not what they mean. So kind of explain like what anti-Federalist stood for and what he stands for and how those two things wouldn't correlate. All right, that's as far as we're going to get today. I will see you guys tomorrow for more cool stuff.